Welcome to Behind the Smile with Ash Butterss, a podcast designed to reveal the truth behind the masks we wear. Together, we look to demystify the human mind and its behaviours in relation to mental health, trauma and addiction. My name's Ash and I'll be your host as we uncover the real stories of people's pain and the steps they've taken to live a life of freedom in recovery. From sobriety to spirituality, join me each week as we uncover the reasons why people seek recovery and how their lives have changed by living one day at a time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Smile. Today's guest is Mary Tilson. Mary is a certified professional recovery coach, yoga and meditation teacher, and the host of the Sun and Moon Sober Living podcast. Having experienced profound shifts as a result of her decision to get sober in 2013, she is passionate about helping other people find freedom from addiction so they can live fulfilling lives substance-free. She is a strong believer in the power of community and enjoys bringing like-minded people together through her online membership community and wellness retreats. Mary recently settled back in the mountains of Colorado after nearly a decade traveling and teaching internationally while living in Southeast Asia, close to us. I had the absolute pleasure of joining Mary on her podcast recently, and I'm so excited to be talking to her once again today. So with that, I'd love to welcome Mary onto Behind the Smile. Mary, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm so glad to be reconnecting again. Thank you so much for having me on.
I know. I feel like there's just so many similarities in how we've both approached our recovery. You've got quite a bit of time on me, but definitely leaning into that space of yoga and meditation and holistic wellness as well as staying sober is something that we both really have in common.
100%. There were so many times I was listening to your story and I was just like, I can connect so much to what you're sharing.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be the same again today. Look, before we dive into your photo, which you've brought along, I'd love for our listeners just to get to know you a little bit better. So can we kick it off with some questions like, where do you live? What does an average day look like? And what do you do for fun?
Sure. So I live in Golden, Colorado now. And an average day for me, I have some non-negotiables that I do in the morning. I have a morning practice and it's usually breathwork and meditation and always some form of movement. And so, now living back in the mountains and it being summer, I try to get out hiking every day if I can. It doesn't always work out that way, but sometime in the mountains, getting outside, doing my yoga practice. And then every day is a little bit different. I have an online community, so I host meetings sometimes, workshops, one-on-one coaching. I'm sometimes recording podcasts. I'm in grad school, so studying at times. And
oh, wow. What are you studying?
I'm studying the psychology and neuroscience of mental health.
Wow, that must be fascinating.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, for me, it's like a big part of my recovery too. I just love learning. And so that's something that I get really excited about too.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. And now what about, I'm guessing for fun, it's probably getting out and doing all those hikes.
Yeah, it's a lot of that. So I love hiking. I love being in nature in general. So going swimming in the creek is something that I really enjoy doing. If I can travel, whether that's a road trip to a national park or, going somewhere far off, I love being in the ocean. And just spending time with family and friends too.
And whereabouts were you predominantly in Southeast Asia?
So I spent a lot of the time living in Indonesia. I was in Bali for part of the time and an island called Sumba, which is a bit more remote. It's about an hour by flight from Bali. Spent some time in Cambodia. I was living in a retreat center there for a year when I first got out there. And a lot of traveling around in between. I'm sure, have you spent a lot of time there growing up in Australia?
Yeah, Bali in particular is pretty much every Australian's second home. If we tend to, it's one of the closest places to get to from here that isn't within Australia. So it's very, very popular with Aussies, as you would know, having spent so much time there.
Definitely. Yeah, there were a lot of Australians that were living in Bali or just coming through all the time. So yeah that would be very nice to have that.
Oh, it's amazing. But what I actually found is, and particularly, I think I'd been probably close to a dozen times before I got sober. And then since getting sober,
just in the last 18 months since COVID lifted, I've been there twice. And the connection I find to Bali now that I'm sober is so much deeper. It's such a spiritual home that when you remove all the substances and the things that we use to distract ourselves, you can really tap into that energy. And it's a place like no other, isn't it?
Yeah, I can imagine that would be such a different experience because you have these different people travel with different intentions. A lot of people are coming on sort of a spiritual journey and wanting to connect with nature and lean into the culture and all of that. And there's also a lot of, partying and stuff like that goes on there. So I think that's what I've realized from traveling in general. There's a lot of places I want to go back to as a sober person and experience them completely different.
I bet. And tell me, have you managed to get back there since the world reopened?
I actually moved back after the world reopened. So I haven't been back since it was a year ago that I came back. So things were just opening up. It was, yeah.
All right. So you going back to the US after the pandemic, how was that?
It was interesting. For me, I mean, it was just an adjustment in general, but I think everyone had such a different experience of that time. So things had pretty much gone back to normal though by the time that I got back to Colorado. So
yeah, nice. And is that where all your friends and family are?
So my two brothers, my younger brothers live in Chicago and I'm living in Colorado. My sister lives out here and my parents live here. And I've got some friends who are here too.
Amazing. And what's the yoga community like in Colorado?
It's great. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of studios that are nearby. And I think that in general, people are very into an active lifestyle and connecting with nature and, different ways of connecting with themselves through breathwork and yoga and a lot of the things that I'm interested in. So yeah, it's been really nice. And I find that connection with yoga, like through traveling, it's a nice way to start to connect with like-minded people too. So that's been nice.
Yoga and recovery, isn't it? It's the same as, you could walk into a 12-step meeting anywhere in the world and you'd get that instant connection. I think it's the same when you walk into a yoga studio anywhere in the world as well.
100%. Yeah. And that's what guided so much of my travels too. Like I was always looking for a new training or a retreat or something like that. And so, yeah, it creates a beautiful global community, just like recovery. I completely agree.
I love that. Mary, I've asked you to bring in a photo today. Now, this is a photo from a time in your life where you are hiding behind a smile. So you were presenting one version of yourself to the outside world, but the reality was internally you were struggling. Mary, can you please describe for our audience, what am I looking at in this photo and what was going on for you at that specific time in your life?
Sure. Yeah. So that photo was taken during a 3-year period in between the first time that I went to treatment for addiction and the second time when I actually got sober. And that first time that I went to treatment, I was in a rapid downward spiral path of self-destruction. I felt completely out of control. And I'd called my parents for help. I was a student at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and I just wanted to get out of there and go home. But next thing you know, I'm in treatment. And I wasn't ready to get sober. I wasn't ready to admit that I had a problem. And so I went through that 6-week program, but I didn't tell anyone. Like I didn't even tell my closest friends. It was secret. I went home in kind of a strange way. I didn't really say what I was doing, just that I needed to take a little break. And so there's this saying that I heard years later, which just really resonated so strongly with my experience, that there's nothing worse than a mind full of AA and a belly full of booze. And you can replace that AA with recovery, any program. But the point being, once I had sat in the rooms and I had heard my story and other people's stories, and I started to learn about addiction, there was no denying it. Like I knew deep down that I had a problem, and I knew that alcohol did not have a place in my life. And so there was something so painful about having had that experience and also no one knowing. Like I was holding this deep, dark secret that I had gone to rehab. I mean, that's kind of a significant thing. And I didn't even tell some of the closest people in my life. So I was in this internal war with myself after that. So at the time that photo was taken, I graduated, I was working a job in Chicago. In many ways, it looked like I had my life together. I was, surrounded by a group of friends, and I'm dressed up and I'm smiling and I'm holding my fancy drink. And at the same time, like, I had so much of an inner conflict going on. And I just felt like, I was really at an internal war with myself. And at that time, I was also hiding some of the drug use. Like, I started doing cocaine in secrecy. And so there was just a lot going on there. And I also kind of laugh when I look at that photo, because you can see like my wrist is already starting to go limp. And I kind of had these like dinosaur claws sometimes when I would get really drunk. I was kind of like, you can see it sometimes in photos. It's like my elbows are lifted and my hands are flopped over. So I, like, on the one hand, I'm all dressed up and smiling, but then also I'm like, so yeah, there's just a lot going on in that photo for me. But yeah, I love the whole concept, as I've told you, of your podcast and this whole theme of behind the smile, because that's exactly it. It was like, I was really fighting so hard to pretend like I had it all together, but I was not in a good place on the inside.
Yeah, it's almost that idea of if I fake it till you make it. If I just pretend like everything's okay, then maybe it will all be okay. But the reality is, like you just described, drinking on knowledge, when you know deep down that you have a problem with alcohol or any other substance and you continue to use it, it no longer works. It actually starts to become a negative experience and not enjoyable. So it's a really uncomfortable place to be in. What age were you, Mary, when you went to your first treatment center?
I was 20. It was my second semester of my junior year of college.
Wow. So that's really young, isn't it?
Yeah. And I didn't know that I was going there. I called my parents in a panic, and I was like, please get me out of here, get me out of here. And, the next thing you know, I'm on a plane. I think I'm just going to like take a little break, go back home to Chicago. All my problems are going to disappear. But yeah, and I didn't know anything about what recovery meant. I didn't know like you were signing on to a lifetime of sobriety. To me, that was like, no way. It was just an instant. And I didn't have anyone modeling it to me at the time.
So have you spoken to your parents about how that all unfolded? Were there secret conversations happening behind closed doors to organize that treatment center to send you off without you knowing? How did that all unfold?
Yeah, well, what happened was, I got back home, and it's not that I was actively fighting it, because I was terrified, and I was going to my parents for help. I had created a lot of drama within my social circle, and I really felt alone and scared. And so it wasn't like they were forcing me to go into it, but, they were like, this is what we think you need to do. And when it came to actually like deciding to go, I didn't really get what that meant. Like, I just agreed. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be home. And then it was a process of like, I had to talk to some of my teachers and make sure that I could get that time off and make up for it. And so it was just like, I was just agreeing and going along with the motions. But what's interesting is I remember so well that after a few days had passed, I started to have that dialogue like, oh, you're not that bad. You can get this under control. And so I went into treatment really looking for ways that I was different than everyone else. And I was so strategic because I started to think, you should be careful because your therapist is not about to go send you back to Boulder, the place that you developed this addiction, and recommend that to your parents if you talk about the extent of your drinking and your drug use. So I don't think I ever mentioned my drug use, or I remember when we'd go around, I never wanted to identify as an addict, and I never really wanted to talk about the drugs. And so I was always really like toning it down and being very strategic. And yeah, I was still in that place of not being able to be honest with myself or anyone else.
You touch on such a good point there, Mary, don't you? Because until we can get completely honest and strip everything back and just put it all out on the table, it makes recovery really, really hard to grasp. And those around us can't offer us the support that we need. I know for me, the final time was the final time because I was so willing to do whatever it takes to do all of the suggested things, but also there was nothing that I was hiding by the end. I was like, here it is. Just take it, please, because I can't do this anymore. Yeah, I think it's a really key piece, that honesty piece.
100%. And that stood out to me. I remember when you were sharing your story, like you were saying you showed up and you were willing to listen and do the work. And I was still in that place of like, no, I can figure this out. I'm different. And that is a huge thing with
Yeah.
how successful you are.
And Mary, I honestly think had I gone into rehab at 20, well, I got taken to a health farm, but it certainly wasn't a rehab. If I'd gone into rehab at 20, I would have done the same thing. I just don't think I would have been ready at that time. Mary, what do I need to know or understand about your childhood that might explain your journey into addiction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, in many ways, like I think back on my childhood, and I grew up in a fortunate situation in the suburbs outside of Chicago. And, I have a big family. I grew up with 4 siblings. We were always very close and supported each other a lot. And, one thing I think about sometimes is I had boys on either side of me, and I definitely had this tough girl persona. And I don't know at what point that I made this decision or I learned this, but I just remember like nobody could ever see me cry. And if my feelings were hurt, like nobody was going to see. I really was very intentional about not letting my feelings be seen when I was hurt. And that was kind of like this persona, and it kind of stuck. Like I remember it was reinforced just through stories, and you get this identity or label attached to you when you're younger, and that's kind of how it always was. And so, yeah, I think I started school early when I was young. And so I was pushed ahead in my class. And I think that also came with some expectation in terms of school and doing well. And I'll never forget, this is something that always stands out to me. When I was in 4th grade, like I remember coming home with my report card had B's on it. And, in the American grading system, that's not that big of a deal. Like it's one step down from an A, but but I just remember like my dad calling me into his office and he was just not having it. And I remember at that time, it was such a big thing to me because I was like, I'm going to be held back and I'm going to lose all my friends. And so from that point on, I kind of learned like, I've got to keep it together in school. So I was always really, despite the fact that a lot of my behavior was not I was not always on my best behavior. Like I knew that how to keep my parents happy was like getting good grades. And so that kind of carried on. Like that was a trend that continued throughout my life. Like even, that year that I left Boulder to go to rehab, I ended up getting like one of my highest GPAs that semester, which just doesn't even make sense, but I think it was like, and I know we've talked about that before too. And that's something that has been big for you too, is like that like, I don't know, that ability that a lot of us share to like be able to like work hard and maintain this while we're in the grips of addiction.
I think for me, it was just that drive to be perfect, and that perfectionistic streak that was so strong that I had to keep up appearances and do whatever I needed to do to make sure everybody thought everything was okay. And that included, being highly academic, being friends with my teachers. And then the other version of me was going out on the weekends and doing all this crazy stuff like we shared on your podcast. Like it's just, and for me, what that really created was such a disconnect because I didn't know which version was actually me.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's really interesting. So I think that both of those things, like, the inability to express my emotions is something that I think really fed into my addiction. Like that was my coping mechanism because I started drinking and experimenting with weed when I was 13. And it just like, that was it. From then on, it was like the center of my social life. And, I wasn't drinking on the school nights, but from that point on, like it was always finding a way to drink whenever I was with other people. So all of like the anxieties and anytime I felt nervous or sad or stressed, it was like I always had something else that would help me get around that. And so I don't think I ever really had to learn how to manage my emotions or to be vulnerable or to express what was on my mind.
Mary, when did it stop being fun?
So it stopped being fun. It was, I went through high school drinking and using drugs or smoking weed. That was the extent of it when I was in high school. But I never remember ever thinking it was a problem or it was going to be a problem. I got in trouble sometimes and had some close calls, but it was never a big deal. It was when I went away to college and I first was introduced to Adderall and cocaine and Molly, or ecstasy.
Mm.
And I remember, I wanted to party every night of the week if I could. Like I wanted to go out all the time. I loved meeting new people. I loved the social life at school. And when I discovered cocaine, it was like, well, this is incredible because now I can stay out later. I don't have to worry about getting really tired and sloppy at the end of the night. Like there was always kind of a pick me up. And so that's when I started to have these pretty intense blackouts. And in my drunken state, when I had been using drugs and drinking so much, I started acting really out of character. And that was the first time that I started remembering waking up and feeling that overwhelming anxiety and wondering, like, what did I say? What did I do? And I would get nervous about seeing people the next morning. And I think, that anxiety was a combination of coming off of the substances, but also, yeah, just the not knowing. It's a really scary feeling when you forget part of the night, or you look at your phone and you like messages you don't remember sending, and like all of these things. And so that was when it started to get really scary for me. And I remember, my response was always to make a joke out of things. It was laughing it off, pretending like I didn't care, like kind of really leaning into this idea of being a party girl and a free spirit, and it was all fine. And so my response, we'd wake up, and if there wasn't class, it'd be like, let's go get Bloody Marys, let's go to the rooftop bar, let's day drink, I just wanted to keep it going. And, Adderall came into my life then, so I could still get good grades. Like it never impacted my schoolwork. And so I was really using that both to study and also using it sometimes to go out at night with my friends. And so that's when things started to get bad. And I remember at that time, that was when, I'd go back home and be with my family, and my parents would start to express concern because we would be, traveling as a family and be in foreign countries. And there were times when I was like passed out in public places and just acting really, really irresponsibly. And things started happening that were really causing concern, and people started bringing it to my attention. So that was when I remember there was this point where I could just feel like my relationship with substances was different, and other people were seeming to have it under control, but like there was this intense desire for more. It felt like, like I remember like I would go out and I would be drinking, and we'd be at like a group dinner and everyone would be ordering drinks, and it was like I was always on like one round ahead. Or, if we were doing drugs, like if we were doing cocaine, it was like I'd be like, how do they just want to do one line? Like I'd be like wanting more, and then I'd be greedy about it. I'd want to get my own. And it was like I could just tell there was a different relationship I had with it.
My gosh, I'm describing the exact same way I was. Oh, yes. Tell me, when people started to approach you with concern, what did you say?
I remember being so angry, like I was so defensive, and I was always trying to point it back. Like I remember it, or looking at someone else. Like I was always comparing myself to someone who was worse off. But I remember, there's one story that still haunts me. I remember being out, I was on a family trip with another family, and I was, we were all drinking, and I was always like rallying people to drink more and drink more. And so I came back with a bunch of shots, and my mom looked at me sort of like, Mary, like kind of like, come on, do you really need another shot? And I like lost it on her in front of like a whole group of people and was like, you are so boring, like get out of here, you ruin everything. And it was like, I knew in that moment, like, that's not who I was. I mean, my mom is like an angel. I have so much respect for her. That's why I'm still haunted by that story. But it was just like, I was always so resistant. I was so protective of my addiction, And so I couldn't really hear it. And it was this strange experience. And I'm curious if like, it was similar for you, where internally, like I was sort of having this conversation with myself, but if it was coming from the outside, I was like so defensive, like put up a wall.
So defensive. Yes. And I really identify with finding the differences, not the similarities. So I'd always look at somebody who was worse than me and I'd go, well, at least I'm not doing that. Or I can't possibly be an alcoholic because I'm not doing that. Like it was just complete deflection so that I didn't want to have to look at my stuff, but I knew deep down that I didn't feel good about the way I was treating my body, the way I was behaving, the things that I was saying when I was under the influence, and really acting out of alignment to my values. That was just, it started to just eat away at me over time.
100%. I think there's this like pain of disconnection when you are out of alignment with your values. And, as hard as I tried to look around, and there was always other people. I mean, there was a lot of hard drugs around me. There was a lot of people who were, I could say were worse off, but it didn't really change the fact that internally I didn't feel good about the fact that I was walking around campus feeling so much shame that people might have seen me acting a certain way or saying a certain thing or heard stories about me from the night before. Like, that wasn't okay with me.
It's so true, isn't it? It's so important that we don't compare to anyone else, because the other reality is everybody's level or barometer of discomfort is different, as the same as everybody's rock bottom looks different. And then that you'll find that there's a basement below the bottom. It's like you have to go back to your internal world and really check in and be guided by, like, am I okay? Do I feel okay with the decisions, the actions, the behaviors that I'm making? And if the answer is no, then that's your message. That's your key to go, okay, well, maybe something needs to change.
100%. I couldn't agree more. I think, that idea of like, that's why it's like taking this time to like go inward and be with ourselves. And it's like, how do I really feel?
When we've spent so many years avoiding that exact thing, that connection. Mary, tell me, what was then the catalyst that led to 2013, which is the year you got sober?
Yeah. So I ended up graduating, moving back to Chicago. I was working at a digital advertising agency. And it's so funny. It's probably no coincidence that I found myself in a job that was so work hard, play hard. Like, you could go out every night of the week if you want to. It was everyone fresh out of school. It was like an extension of college. I mean, we worked with some amazing brands, and really, like, I have so much respect for this agency. And so many brilliant people work there, but we had a good time, and there was like, we were always being invited to go to these dinners followed by a night out at the bars and concerts. And it was just endless, and there was a beer cart that went around our office on Fridays. It would be totally normal to have like hangover food waiting after like a big, notoriously drunk party. And so, I mean, once again, I found myself in a situation where it was completely normalized to be getting drunk every night and be getting, seriously drunk with my coworkers. And once again, I'm in that position where I'm walking through the office, like feeling a bunch of shame. And, that was the point too, when I started using drugs in secrecy. And so I no longer felt comfortable, or like people were kind of moving on with their lives. And so, people didn't want to do cocaine in the middle of the week or on a Sunday afternoon. And I really wanted to, like, I wanted to keep that going. And I felt a lot of shame around that. And I didn't want to be the one that was constantly suggesting it, and people being like, really? Like, can we just like go out for a few drinks? And so I started doing it secretly on my own. And that was something, like, talk about being out of alignment. I mean, I just remember I'd wake up in the morning and be like, how are you doing this? Like, it just created so much confusion, and I didn't really trust myself anymore. I started to feel so worried that like I was engaging in that kind of behavior. And so basically what happened was, I started doing that first, like when I would be out with friends, and I would be like kind of going off in the bathroom and doing little bumps. And then it started happening when I was at work events, like when I would be with other coworkers and stuff like that. And so like the paranoia and the fear around getting caught in that situation just started to amplify. And then I started going home and continuing alone in my room. And so like towards the end, what would happen is I would kind of come to and be like, I'm supposed to be on the train going to work, and I'm having these moments alone with myself where it wasn't fun anymore. It was just like feeling so controlled by this. And I think because of the exposure that I already had to recovery, and, like, that the seeds had already been planted at that time. And at that time, the first time that I went to treatment, I had also started to practice yoga more regularly. And so it was like, I had to prove it to myself again and again. I was so stubborn. It was like, but it got to a point where basically the evidence was just so clear. And the last day when my final time ever using was one of those nights. Like, I'd gone out, I'd been drinking, using cocaine by myself, decided at the end of, it's probably like, 3, 4 in the morning when I'm like super high in cocaine, it's not really a day that I can call in sick for work. So I decided I was going to go into the office. Like, I'll be fine. I can just push through. I can get some Adderall, like whatever I need to do. And I actually went into work that day. So I had been out drinking all night and I had been doing cocaine all night. And I'm on no sleep, and I'm going into my office on Michigan Avenue in Chicago thinking that I'm going to sit in front of Excel all day and put together some master plan, And so I got there. Fortunately, I got there at a crazy early hour. Nobody else was there. It took, just sitting in front of my computer and kind of looking at the screen and being like, are you kidding? Like, it all became very clear, like being in that setting. And so fortunately, I had the sense to leave. And I went back home. And when I got back home, I was just like, I'm done, and I had actually there was a couple of weeks leading up to that where I had started confessing to people in my life and just kind of like, I had to get the secrets out. Like I had to tell someone what I was doing. I was carrying so much shame about the whole thing. And so I got back that day and I knew what it meant. I was like, I need to be sober and this is it. And so I called my mom and I didn't want to tell her over the phone. I was like, hey, no work today. Do you want to come downtown for coffee? And, she sat down on my couch and I basically was just like, I told her, like, I was like, I have a serious drug and alcohol problem. I cannot stop doing cocaine and I can't stop myself. And I'm really scared that something terrible is going to happen because I honestly feel so grateful that nothing bad did happen. But I really feel like I was like dancing on that edge. And so, yeah, that was it. And then I went back to the same treatment center. I went to Hazleton in Chicago and I went in with a totally different mindset that time. It was that complete willingness. Like I was experiencing it entirely differently. I went in with so much gratitude that, first of all, like to have the resources to be able to do that is such a gift. And I was just, I was going to take full advantage of it. So yeah, I actually was still working at that time. So I was going during the night. It was a nights and weekends program. And
oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. And did you tell anyone at work or were you just jetting off at night to go do what you needed to do?
Well, so that was a complicated part of it because at this job that I was working, it was, technically it's a 9 to 5, but nobody was leaving the office at my team at that time at 5 o'clock. Like we were working late into the night or we were going out and doing like work events. And so I told my supervisor on my team, she was the only one that I told. And I didn't, once again, like I did not tell people in my life. I told one of my best friends who is my roommate. But again, I was like, I had so much shame about my recovery. That was something that took me a long time to get through. But I had to tell my supervisor because I needed to be able to leave. And that was really stressful for me because we were a team. And so it doesn't really look good when one person like shuts down and leaves. At 5 o'clock and everybody is like meant to be finishing up what they're doing. But she was really understanding. And I also kind of got lucky because I rotated off that team shortly afterwards. And so I was on 3 different teams while I was on that agency. But that particular team was when I was like the worst version of myself, I felt. And so yeah, it did work out well. And I was very grateful for that. I was able to, leave. And I had a conversation with myself where it had gotten to the point where I just thought, if this is not okay, then it's worth it. Like it'll be okay. Like if I have to take some time out of my job and I can't leave to focus on my recovery, then that's just going to have to be okay.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true, isn't it? Like we have to put it first. Otherwise we lose everything else anyway.
Yeah. I mean, Mary, I had tried to do it. I had tried to do it on my own and it wasn't working,
Yeah, exactly. Mary, I'd love to know, tell me firstly, what was the gap in between rehab number 1 and the second time you went back? Was it a year or 2?
It was 3 years.
3 years. Okay. What would you say to someone? Because what I love about this story is that you went back to the same rehab and received the same information. The thing that was different was you, and it was your willingness. And it was the same for me. I'd been to 12-step meetings prior to going to rehab and I never heard anything because I had cotton wool in my ears. And once the cotton wool was removed, I was able to receive the same message that I'd heard time and time again, but it landed differently. So for somebody who maybe has a loved one who's struggling, but they don't seem ready yet, do you still think it's beneficial to go down the path of treatment, hoping that maybe something rubs off, knowing that they can go back? Or do you think it's better just to wait until somebody puts their hands up and says, I'm done, I've had enough, I surrender?
Oh my gosh, this is such a good question. And this is something I feel really passionate about because you do hear this message a lot that like there's nothing you can do until someone's ready and they have to like ride it out themselves and hit a bottom. And I'm so grateful that that wasn't the case for me and that my parents were really adamant about me going to see someone and get help and going to treatment. And had I not known that those resources were available, like had I not known that there was somewhere that I could go to get help and that there was a community of people that not only the people that I associated with addiction, like the stigmatized version of addiction, but I had been, how it is when you go to meetings, you're like, oh my gosh, these are people from all walks of life. Like it's the doctor on their lunch break. It's the person who's coming out of university. It's all these different people. It is the person who's living on the street. It's all of these people are coming together and you realize that, this is something that affects everyone. So all of that had a really profound effect on me. And had I not had that information, I don't know how it would have turned out, and like I said, there was a certain pain of knowing that, like what I said earlier about like having the recovery information and drinking anyway, like having that information was a vital piece in recognizing that I did have a problem and connecting those dots. So I think it is really important. And I think there's ways to show up for loved ones that are coming from a place of love and, offering tools and offering support and things like that really can make a big difference.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I completely agree. Okay, switching gears for a moment, I want to talk about yoga. Now, for me, I discovered yoga probably about 5 years before getting sober. And I remember I would go to classes. In the beginning, I would go and I would enjoy it, but I was kind of doing it more from like a fitness mentality. Like I was wanting to stay fit. So I was going for that reason. And then as my drinking progressed, I found that I was going less, but I was still really drawn to it. There was almost like I was trying to find this spiritual solution outside of myself, but I was so disconnected that it wasn't quite resonating at the time. And then when I got sober, I returned back to yoga and I was practicing online because it was during COVID and we were all locked down and it was one of the only ways I was able to sort of move my body. And the connection I found in the spirituality of yoga and realizing that it was so much more than just the physical poses was something that really, it blew my mind, and it led me to then retrain as a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher. And that's, what I'm currently doing today, as you know. I'd love to know how long into your recovery journey did yoga become this really big part of your world?
Yeah, I love that we have this in common too, because it is so amazing. My mom had been practicing yoga since I was a kid. And that first time that I went home to treatment and I was staying in Chicago, we were going to classes together. And fortunately, we were practicing with a teacher who really wove in the philosophy and brought a lot of deeper layers of the teachings into the practice. And I was starting to gain an understanding of that. And I started to, when I went back to school, despite the fact that I was still drinking and using drugs, I started to go to yoga class when I was back at school, which to me was like a huge thing. Like it felt like pretty significant that I was actually going to practice. But when I went to treatment, I was terrified. After that treatment program ended, I was terrified of how I was going to spend my nights and weekends in Chicago, which I thought was just a drinking city. And that's what everybody does to socialize. And it's changed so much since then, but it really did feel that way. And so I signed up for my first 200-hour yoga teacher training at that time. And so it was one of those things where instinctively I knew that there was something deeper than the physical practice. And I'd heard a little bit of it and I could experience directly how it was helping me support my recovery. But I remember when we started to get into the philosophy and, speaking about the 8 limbs and more specifically the yamas and the niyamas, I just started to realize there was this like incredible sense of familiarity between what I had heard in the rooms of recovery and the 12 steps. And as I said, I was still really quiet. I was very secretive about my recovery outside of the recovery community. So I'm like having these moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm getting all excited about this in my training and realizing like, surely I'm not the first one who has recognized and put this together before. And that actually led me to one of my teachers, Nikki Myers, who founded Yoga of 12-Step Recovery. And I've since been able to like really connect the dots on these paths and realize that they are so incredibly similar. And the beautiful thing about yoga is that, both give us these cognitive and spiritual tools. And then yoga, of course, brings in the somatic piece. And so I just find that, the way that those practices come together, and even looking like specifically, if you like work your way through the steps, like you can literally connect the dots with aspects of yoga philosophy.
I remember having the exact same realization. I think it was maybe the first or second week I was in my 200-hour yoga teacher training, and I was 2 years sober at the time. And my jaw just dropped to the floor. I was like, in so many ways, they're the same program. Like, it was just blowing my mind. For our listeners who may not be drawing these dots together, what are some of the common threads between yoga and the 12 steps?
Yeah. So I think, first and foremost, it's that idea of rigorous honesty. And, one of the things that, we've already spoken about, it's like one of the defining characteristics of my addiction was an inability to be honest with myself and other people. And so this concept of like satya and truth telling in yoga is a huge component of it. And, one of the biggest ones you mentioned, like spirituality. When I first encountered the 12 steps, as I know is the case with a lot of people, I found the word God and surrendering to a higher power, handing my will over to God as I understood him, was it was a barrier for me, and not in a way that I wasn't against religion, and it wasn't that I had any bad experience, but I just felt like this time I'm ready and willing, and I want to do what I need to do. But at the same time, this doesn't feel like a stable foundation for me to hand my will over to God, because I understood God through Christianity. And I had this image of like God as like a man in the sky. And so what was amazing about that is, of course, and it doesn't have to be like that. Like the 12 steps don't limit it to that idea. That's just how I was hearing it at that time. And so through the exploration of yoga and this concept of like Ishvara Pranidhana and surrendering to a higher power, I started to have a more expanded view of like what a higher power could be for me. And, to me, when I think about addiction, it's so much of a condition of like being stuck in this limited self, like our ego, and just feeling so separate and like just fighting so hard to like protect and disconnect myself. And so when I think about like surrendering to a higher power, it's just kind of like letting go of that limited sense of self. And I remember at that same time, as I'm kind of like exploring these concepts simultaneously, somebody in recovery, opened up the possibility of like, what if nature was your higher power? And I think through my practice of yoga and having this sort of experience that felt deeply spiritual on my mat, and also like going out in nature and bringing that level of presence that we cultivate in our practice, it was like I didn't have to go out looking for God in nature. If I was like fully open to watching the sunrise or being present and looking at like an ancient mountain range or, being in the ocean, it's like you just feel like something spiritual. You don't need to attach a name to it or anything. And so I think that yoga allowed me to experience the benefits of the 12 steps, because it just allowed me to kind of like explore it from a different angle. And, I know a lot of people arrive at that anyway, so I don't want to suggest that the 12 steps are limited to that. That's just how I was hearing it. Like I heard it through a very specific filter.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think you're alone at all, Mary. There are so many people that I've spoken to in the last few years who've had a similar experience with the barriers around the God word and connecting to a higher power. So to find that there is this other area that you can explore that perhaps supports that connection on another level, like I know that was the same for me, is awesome. So say somebody was really curious and wanting to dip their toes more into this space, but they weren't ready to commit to, say, a 200-hour teacher training. What would you suggest?
Yeah. And I think that, you don't need to necessarily go through a teacher training. That's just how I ended up like understanding yoga philosophy better. But I would say one of my favorite books to recommend to people who are interested in learning more about yoga philosophy is The Wisdom of Yoga by Stephen Cope. And I remember I picked up that book early on, and it teaches you about the philosophy through the stories of real people and their experiences. And I just found that to be really helpful, because that was what allowed these teachings to stick with me, is like I was applying them directly to my experience with addiction. And so I would say, looking into studying the philosophy and seeking out teachers, because there's a lot of amazing teachers that actually do weave in the philosophy. And I think a lot more studios now, especially as things are going online, like you can do a sutra study course, or you can read some of the text yourself. You can get a copy or a translation of the Yoga Sutras. And I always recommend doing that in some form of study group, because sometimes just taking it in as a surface level. But like I said, I mentioned yoga of 12-step recovery. I like can't help but say my teacher Nikki Meyer's name at every opportunity, because she's an amazing teacher, has an amazing recovery story of her own, and she teaches like weekend immersions and workshops. And so yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can study and bring these things together.
That's great. That's great to know. And I'll make sure I pop all of those references in the episode show notes for everyone listening along here today. What about meditation and breath work? How does that support your recovery?
Yeah, so I found, for me, different breathing practices have been really supportive. And breathwork has been like such a journey for me. When I first started, it was really pranayama practices, and I was using a lot of practices that were really helping me to calm my mind. And so doing breathing practices that would allow me to really calm my system and get into a place where meditation was more accessible, because I realized that the chaos that was going on inside and just like everything that was going on, just like plopping down and sitting down, was not realistic for me. And so, I started with a lot of those types of techniques, but more recently with breath work, I've been exploring a lot of different forms of breath work that's more like Wim Hof style breathing, and some of the transformative breath work that's a little bit more activating. And you know, I the first time I tried those practices years ago, I didn't really enjoy them. Like, it was too activating for my system. But, more recently, as I've been processing some really challenging things in my life, and I realized this pattern of like disconnecting from my emotions, like I through these breathwork practices, it was just like allowing me to feel a lot that was just really deeply buried inside. And so I just continue through the process of recovery and like exploring new tools. I think that, we have all of these tools available to us that don't require us to turn to substances, that can either calm us down, that can allow us to process emotions, that can activate us and wake us up. And so, breathwork has been huge in just finding ways to balance my energy, to process emotions, to prepare for meditation. And then, meditation, I think of these practices as just kind of creating space in my life. And for me, so much of my addiction was like being in this cycle, like caught in this cycle where it was like I didn't realize where the space was between this like craving and the impulse and actually acting on it. It's like, we're in that space of like, we feel like we're so stuck. And by having practices like yoga and breathwork and meditation that allow me to slow down, I feel like I gain access to that sacred pause, like the moment of choice, which started off like the tiniest little sliver. Like, I remember the first time being like, oh my gosh, like I can notice that this is happening and actually choose differently. And so it's been hugely empowering for me. And I think it's so funny looking back, because like so many other people, I operated in a mentality of like, I don't have the time. I'm sure you've heard all of these things and maybe like thought them yourself even. It's like we feel like I don't have the time. Now I realize like I cannot afford to not do these practices. I cannot afford to move through my life acting on every impulse, because that will take me out so quickly. So it's like I've just gained a whole new appreciation through experience too, of like what it means to actually create these spacious moments where I'm just being present and I'm just able to observe sensations arising in my body, thoughts arising, and recognizing that there is choice in those moments.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, there's so much goodness in everything you just shared then, Mary. I actually sent my email out to my community last week, was all around the power of the pause and that opportunity we have to either respond or react in any given moment. And that's something that we cultivate through this practice of meditation specifically, I find, but also even, getting onto the mat or engaging in breath work. And speaking of breath work, I know it's becoming more and more popular, and I actually have just engaged with a breathwork practitioner to do some work one-on-one, because a couple of weeks ago I took a work trip up to Queensland and I had something happen where I was emotionally triggered. Now, I didn't want to drink or use, but I had a full fight or flight panic response. And I haven't experienced something like that in a really long time. And what's happened in addition to this is it's had a bit of a flow-on effect. And as of last Sunday, I woke up with overwhelm and anxiety that I haven't experienced in a really long time. And it's been dipping in and out of intensity, but I'm like, okay, hello, old friend. I know this feeling. And for me, anxiety often manifests in health, like a fear of my health deteriorating. And so I looked at my options and I thought, I can definitely engage with my therapist, but I really feel like this is a trauma that's stuck in my body and I want to work on it somatically. And so I'll keep you posted on how I go with it, because I'm really looking forward to just being able to shift that and to not be afraid of the process. I know it's going to be painful and there's stuff that's clearly stuck there, because that's why I was triggered. If it was gone, I wouldn't have had that response, right? But just knowing that we have these tools available, and to your point, we don't have to pick up a drink or a drug to escape reality, but we can actually lean into the discomfort and use it as an opportunity to grow.
100%. And I think, just hearing you speak to that, it's like in recovery, what I've learned is like, it's a process and new things will happen. And there's not a promise that your life is going to be so easy now that you've gotten sober. Like, the hardest year of my life was just recently, and I had been sober for almost a decade at that time. And I felt completely like I needed to draw on an entire new set of tools, And so I'm so grateful that I have the awareness now and the distance from my substance use, that I no longer default to thinking, oh, I know the perfect escape. Like, I'll just disconnect from myself, I'll numb out. But sometimes we do have to like seek out what other tools are available to us. And it is so incredible because, like, so much of this lives in our body. And so I think that, having tools like movement and breath work, and I've been really into cold exposure lately. I mean, that's something that really helps me with anxiety. I don't know if you'd want to sit in an ice bath, but
I think I might need to.
It's like, I get blown away and I get so excited about these things, because it's like, there's like just sitting in a cold bucket of ice, it can create this like incredible dopamine spike, and that's what I was always looking for in a drug, but it's not going to have this incredible come down effect. So I think recovery actually empowers us in the fact that we know like there's all these other tools and we have this ability to shift our internal state.
That perfectly leads into my next question, which is, I think we have a really similar approach to our recovery in that we look at it through a holistic lens. What does that mean for you, and why is it so important to have this holistic approach rather than a one-size cookie-cutter approach to recovery?
I think it's really important because ultimately, like, it's not about the substance. Like, for me, it's not about alcohol or cocaine or Adderall or like whatever it is that I'm turning to in that specific moment. It's been understanding like what's underlying that. What is it that is motivating me to reach for a substance and to disconnect from myself and get outside of myself? And so I think that we do need to like work on the deeper levels or deeper layers. And, a lot of times I think in my case, it was like being in this state of dysregulation, in my nervous system and feeling really anxious and overwhelmed and not really knowing how to handle what I was experiencing. And so like understanding those deeper layers, that's what's allowed me to really free myself from these impulsive behaviors, which I felt like I was really stuck on. Like it was just happening as an automatic response. And so, to me, it's kind of better understanding. And this is like, a question that I continue to ask myself and I'm continuing to explore because it's manifested in a lot of different ways in my life. And so like understanding, what is at the root of this and how can I meet that need in a different way? And so I think, I've had to really change the way that my relationship with work and obviously my relationship with substances, my relationship with other people, my environment, how I spend my time. And so I think we need to take in the whole picture because the things that really support us in staying balanced and not feeling like we need to reach for a substance are things that don't necessarily seem related to alcohol, like movement and the food that we're putting into our body and the meditation and breath work. And, I could go on, but.
Yeah, no, it is. It's that holistic approach. Mary, there's so much goodness in the conversation we've had here today, and I could talk to you for hours. And I'm just praying, I hope one day we do get to connect and meet in person because, you are such a light. I have one final question that I would love to ask you now, and that question is, what are your 3 non-negotiables that allow you to live your life today happy, joyous, and free?
That's a good question. So nature, 100%. Like I can't imagine living my life without being close to nature again. Movement, like being able to have some way of being connected with my body, and then connection to my family, like being able to, and really that extends, I would say family and friends, but if I were to like get super specific, it's being able to have that connection in my life on a regular basis.
Oh, that's beautiful. I absolutely agree with all 3 of those. They're vital parts of my recovery as well. Mary, if people want to find out more about you, check out the podcast, your yoga and meditation work, where should they go?
So I have a website, sunandmoonsoberliving.com, and there's some resources on there. There's a membership community. I also have a podcast, the Sun and Moon Sober Living Podcast. And I'm pretty active on Instagram, so it's at sunandmoon.soberliving. And I like sharing on there. It's been such a fun way to connect with other people in the sober community. And my DMs are always open, I like to say. Like I love connecting with people, so feel free to reach out anytime.
Awesome. I'll make sure I pop all of that information in the episode show notes. Mary, we say here on Behind the Smile that when we recover loudly, no one need suffer in silence. So thank you so much for coming here today, for sharing your energy, your time, and your story. I am greatly, greatly appreciative.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Like I said, I have just so much respect for the work that you do and the whole message behind the Smile. So I'm really grateful to have been able to share.
Thanks, Mary.
A big thank you for tuning in today. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by clicking the subscribe button and leaving a review. Every review helps this podcast become more discoverable, meaning more people can hear these stories of strength and hope. Together, we will continue to remove the stigma around mental health, trauma, and addiction. Remember to reach out to those you care about, and I'll see you next time.